June 18, 2001, 7:55 in the morning, East Tilbury, Essex. It was an ordinary Monday, the kind of morning that doesn't feel historic, the kind that blends into every other school day. A uniform neatly pressed, breakfast half finished, a quick goodbye. At the door, 15-year-old Danielle Jones stepped outside her family home just before a.m. She closed the gate behind her and turned left, the same direction she always walked to school. Her brother watched from the upstairs window. Everything looked normal. Then, seconds later, something changed. Danielle slowed down. She hesitated, and then she turned around. Instead of continuing toward school, she walked in the opposite direction. It was a tiny moment, a small shift, the kind of detail no one would ever think twice about, but that turn would become the last confirmed sighting of Danielle Jones. She never made it to school. She hadn't packed spare clothes. She hadn't taken extra money. She didn't bring her phone charger. She hadn't told her parents she was going anywhere different. By that evening, she still hadn't come home. When the school called to say Danielle hadn't shown up for class, her mother, Linda, felt something cold settle in her chest. Danielle wasn't rebellious. She wasn't the kind of teenager who skipped school for fun. Even if she had, and that was hard to imagine, she would have been home before dark. She was afraid of the dark. As the afternoon stretched into evening, calls started flooding her phone. Friends texting, relatives calling. No response. That, alone, was terrifying. Danielle was the type of girl who left notes if she went next door. She would call to say she'd arrived somewhere safely. Always. But now, there was nothing. Then came the first unsettling detail. Witnesses reported seeing Danielle near a blue van that morning. A man was inside, talking to her. One person said it looked like an argument. Another said the girl seemed uncomfortable. The blue van belonged to her uncle, Stuart Campbell. On the surface, he looked like a devoted family man, a builder, a father of two, married to Danielle's aunt. He'd been part of family gatherings for years, but something about him had always felt slightly off. Linda would later describe him as charming, almost magnetic, but overly confident. The kind of man who filled a room a little too easily. He visited their home often, very often, 4 or 5 times a week. Sometimes he would wait by his van near Danielle's school bus stop, making sure everyone saw he was there. Danielle hated that. She was shy. She didn't like attention. Her father, Tony, once walked into the living room and found Stuart sitting very close to her on the couch, teasing her. "Why are you blushing, Danielle? Why are you so shy?" When Tony asked what was going on, Stuart brushed it off with a laugh. "Nothing." That's the problem with moments like that. They don't look like crimes. They look like misunderstandings. And accusing a family member of something inappropriate, especially without proof, can destroy relationships forever. So life continued. Until June 18th, 3 days passed with no sign of Danielle. Search dogs traced her path. She had walked in her usual direction, then turned back. After that, the trail faded. Volunteers combed through fields and streets. Neighbors opened sheds and garages for inspection. The entire community of East Tilbury mobilized. Everyone was searching. Everyone except Stuart Campbell. That detail didn't go unnoticed. When Tony went to Stuart's house, no one answered. Through the window, he spotted video equipment set up in the living room. It struck him as odd, wrong somehow. Meanwhile, police began digging into Stuart's past. What they uncovered was disturbing. Years earlier, he had kept a 14-year-old girl in his home and taken explicit photographs of her. He had admitted to it. He'd served time. But within the family, it had been explained away as a misunderstanding, something exaggerated, something unfair. Our investigators were seeing a pattern stretching back nearly 2 decades. Dozens of young girls. The same method every time. Gain trust, isolate, control. When detectives searched Danielle's bedroom, they found 2 notes in a pencil case. "Hi Princess. Hope you have a lovely holiday. Text me when you get back. Love, Stuart. Kiss." Another read, "Hi Princess. If you missed my last note, I just wanted you to know I miss your smile." He had left them while the family was on vacation. Danielle never told her mother about the notes, but she told a friend. That friend was deeply disturbed. How had he entered the house? Why would he leave something like that in her bedroom? Police suspected he still had access, possibly a spare key from renovation work he'd done at the property. When officers searched Stewart's home, they found photography equipment, explicit images of young girls, indecent material downloaded from the internet. In the attic, hidden inside a bag, they discovered women's underwear and handcuffs, and then they found a pair of white stockings. There were bloodstains on them. Forensic testing revealed a mixture of DNA. Stewart's and Danielle's. Then came something that briefly reignited hope. A text message had been sent from Danielle's phone after she disappeared. "Hi Stu. Thanks for being so nice. You're the best uncle ever. Tell Mom I'm sorry. Love you loads." For a moment, her parents wondered could she still be alive? But investigators quickly felt something was wrong. The writing style didn't match Danielle's usual texting habits. She typically wrote in lowercase. The spelling patterns were different. One word stood out immediately. She had never spelled "what" the way it appeared in the message. Not once in her previous texts. A forensic linguist analyzed it. The conclusion? The message was likely staged. Cell tower data made things worse. At the time the message was sent, both Danielle's phone and Stewart's phone were connected to the same mobile base station. For nearly 30 hours after her disappearance, both phones remained in the same area near his home. His alibi, a supposed trip to a home improvement store, didn't line up with the data. The phone call he claimed he made to his wife, records showed it never happened. 5 days after Danielle vanished, just before midnight, police made their move. Stewart Campbell was arrested, but there was one devastating problem. They had no body. The entire case would have to be built on circumstantial evidence, and just when investigators felt they were closing in, the story took an unexpected turn, one that briefly shifted attention away from Stewart and introduced a completely different name, a new suspect, a new possibility, and for Danielle's family, another emotional earthquake. But to understand how everything unraveled from there, we need to go deeper into what Stewart had been building for years. When police arrested Stewart Campbell, they weren't just investigating a disappearance anymore. They were trying to understand a pattern, because Danielle's case didn't begin on June 18, 2001. It had started years earlier, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. At first, Stewart's presence in Danielle's life looked harmless. He was the fun uncle, the one who showed up unexpectedly, the one who joked, who brought attention, who made himself central in every room he entered. But as detectives reviewed witness statements, old reports, and newly seized material from his home, something far more calculated began to emerge. This wasn't random. It was grooming, systematic, patient, intentional. Stewart had a history of presenting himself as a photographer specializing in glamour shoots. He handed out business cards. He approached teenage girls with compliments. He built trust, slowly telling them they were beautiful, unique, special, different. Once he gained their confidence, he would invite them to his home under the guise of professional photography. Parents were reassured. The environment seemed controlled, safe, until it wasn't. Over nearly 2 decades, investigators identified around 30 young victims connected to him in some way. Some had posed for photographs. Others described uncomfortable interactions. A few had experienced far worse, and yet, somehow, he had managed to convince those closest to him that he was misunderstood. Even after serving time for keeping a 14-year-old girl in his home and taking explicit photographs of her, he returned to family life as though nothing had fundamentally changed. That ability to rewrite reality would become a key part of the prosecution's theory, because according to investigators, Stewart hadn't just targeted Danielle physically, he had targeted her emotionally. As Danielle entered her teenage years, normal friction began developing between her and her parents. Nothing extreme, just the typical push and pull of adolescence. Mood swings, arguments, independence clashing with protection. But Stewart inserted himself directly into that tension. During questioning, he painted a dramatic picture of the Jones household. He claimed Danielle and her father could barely be in the same room. He described himself as a middle broker, someone trying to keep peace between parents and daughter. It sounded almost heroic, but detectives saw something else. He was creating division. Linda would later say that one of Stewart's most manipulative tactics was encouraging distance between teenage girls and their families. He would tell them that their parents didn't understand them, that he did. He positioned himself as the safe place, the secret keeper. Police discovered a journal in Stewart's possession, what they later referred to as the Danielle Diary. It documented calls, text messages, encounters, even casual conversations. The entries revealed something deeply unsettling: fixation. He wasn't just an uncle spending time with his niece, he was tracking her. There was another incident that deeply troubled investigators. Stewart had taken Danielle shopping and to the cinema. She later confided in a friend that during the outing, he had held her hand. The friend's father sensed something wasn't right, but he chose not to confront Danielle's parents. He worried about damaging family relationships. That silence would haunt him later, because grooming thrives in silence. While Stewart remained on bail, police surveillance intensified, but his behavior didn't reflect that of a worried uncle desperate to find his missing niece. Instead, officers observed him driving around parking lots, photographing silver cars similar to his own Nissan Primera. Investigators believed he was trying to manufacture confusion, building a narrative that similar vehicles were common in the area, creating reasonable doubt. Every move felt strategic. Then came the forensic analysis that tightened the circle. Telecommunications experts reviewed cell site data. Stewart had claimed he was at a home improvement store roughly 30 minutes away on the morning Danielle disappeared. But mobile records contradicted him. His phone had remained in the East Tilbury and Corringham area. More critically, at the exact time Danielle's phone sent those text messages, both devices were connected to the same mobile base station, and after that, the two phones stayed within range of each other for approximately 30 hours. 30 hours. If Danielle had been alive and moving independently, that data would look different. It didn't. Forensic linguists then analyzed the text messages supposedly sent by Danielle. The tone was wrong. The structure was wrong. She normally wrote in lowercase. The messages used capital letters. Certain words were spelled in ways she had never used before. Even small stylistic markers, things most people never think about, didn't align with her previous digital footprint. Experts concluded that the messages were likely staged, crafted to suggest she was still alive. It was a chilling realization, because it meant whoever sent them wasn't just covering tracks, they were manipulating hope. While this evidence mounted, public attention intensified. The case was featured on Crime Watch, bringing millions of viewers into the search. Danielle's parents appeared on national television. Her father spoke calmly but firmly. He did not believe for a second that his daughter had run away. Linda looked into the camera and pleaded, if anyone knew anything, even the smallest detail, they needed to come forward. Because time was no longer neutral, time was the enemy. Tips flooded in. More than 100 reported sightings across the UK and even parts of Europe. Everyone had to be investigated. If even one credible sighting went unchecked, it could weaken a future murder conviction. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. 12 days before Stewart's trial was set to begin, a body was discovered in woodland in Hampshire. For a brief moment, speculation erupted. Could this finally be Danielle? Forensic teams worked through the night. The remains were identified as Millie Dowler, another schoolgirl who had disappeared and been murdered by serial offender Levi Belfield. The news devastated Danielle's family in a different way. As horrific as it sounds, part of them had clung to the possibility that any discovered body might not be her, that Danielle might still be alive somewhere. That fragile thread snapped again. The investigation moved forward. Despite no body being found, prosecutors from the Crown Prosecution Service determined the evidence was strong enough to charge Stewart Campbell with abduction and murder. He would remain in custody. And as the trial approached, the Jones family faced a new nightmare. They would have to sit in a courtroom and look at the man who once sat at their dinner table, the man who called Their daughter, Princess. The man who, prosecutors argued, had carefully constructed an emotional trap that ended in irreversible tragedy. The case would rely entirely on circumstantial evidence. No confession, no body, just patterns, digital traces, DNA on white stockings, a diary of obsession, and a story the jury would have to piece together. But the courtroom battle was only beginning, and what happened inside that courtroom would shape not only the verdict, but the future of forensic digital evidence in criminal trials. The trial began at Chelmsford Crown Court. It was scheduled to last 8 weeks, but for Danielle's family, it felt like time had already stopped the day she disappeared. When Stuart Campbell walked into that courtroom, he didn't look like a man accused of murdering his 15-year-old niece. Observers described him as calm, self-assured, almost detached. That unsettled people. Because this wasn't just a murder trial. This was a trial without a body. No remains had ever been found. No crime scene had been identified. There was no forensic timeline showing exactly how Danielle died. The prosecution had to convince the jury of something profound, that Danielle Jones was dead, and that Stuart Campbell had killed her, without ever showing them a body. From the very beginning, prosecutors made their argument clear. This was not a random abduction. It was the final step in a long process of grooming. They laid out the pattern. Years of inappropriate closeness, the diary documenting every interaction, the high princess notes left in her bedroom while the family was away, the shopping trips, the hand-holding, the emotional wedge driven between Danielle and her parents. Then came the forensic evidence, the white stockings found hidden in his attic, bloodstains, a mixture of DNA Danielle's and Stuart's. The courtroom fell silent when that detail was explained. Because DNA doesn't argue, it doesn't exaggerate, it simply exists. The defense tried to suggest innocent transfer, secondary contamination, alternative explanations, but the context made that difficult. Then prosecutors turned to the text messages. The message sent from Danielle's phone after she disappeared. "Hi Stu. Thanks for being so nice. You're the best uncle ever." If taken at face value, it suggested she was alive after leaving home. But experts dismantled that narrative piece by piece. A forensic linguist testified that the writing style did not match Danielle's known texting patterns. She typically used lowercase letters. The message used capital letters. Certain spellings and phrasing were inconsistent with hundreds of her previous texts. One word stood out, a spelling variation she had never used before. The expert explained something powerful to the jury. Language is like a fingerprint. Small stylistic habits form over time. They're unconscious, and they're difficult to fake. The conclusion? The message was likely authored by someone else. Then came the telecommunications evidence. Cell site analysis placed both Stuart's phone and Danielle's phone within range of the same mobile base station when the message was sent. And not just briefly, for approximately 30 hours after Danielle vanished. Both phones remained in the same geographic area near Stuart's home. His alibi, a trip to a home improvement store about 30 minutes away, collapsed under scrutiny. Phone records showed he never made the call to his wife that he claimed would confirm his location. Every digital thread led back to him, but still there was no body. The defense leaned heavily on that absence. They suggested Danielle could have run away. That reported sightings across the country proved she might still be alive. More than 800 alleged sightings had been logged by police. The prosecution countered carefully. Every sighting had been investigated. None were credible. None placed Danielle alive beyond the morning she disappeared. Then the focus shifted to Stuart's past. The jury heard about his previous conviction involving a 14-year-old girl. They saw evidence of explicit photographs of minors found in his home. They learned about indecent images downloaded from the internet. The defense argued this was prejudicial, that it painted him as a moral but not necessarily a murderer. The prosecution argued something else: pattern, control, fixation, escalation. They described how he positioned himself as Danielle's protector while quietly isolating her emotionally from her family. They pointed to his behavior after her disappearance, driving around photographing similar silver cars, as if constructing an alternative narrative. It didn't look like grief. It looked like strategy. Throughout the trial, Stewart remained mostly silent, but observers noted that he frequently passed handwritten notes to his legal team during testimony, correcting, clarifying, objecting through them. Even in the courtroom, he appeared to need control. For Danielle's parents, sitting in that room was unbearable. This was the first time they had seen him since their daughter vanished. They had once trusted him, shared meals with him, celebrated holidays with him. Now, they listened as prosecutors described him as a manipulative predator who had groomed their child for years. Linda later said looking at him across the courtroom felt like staring at a stranger wearing someone else's face. As the weeks passed, tension built, because ultimately, the jury had to answer a terrifying question: can you convict a man of murder without a body? After 11 weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, expert analysis, and emotional statements, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom waited. Danielle's family waited. And somewhere behind prison walls, Stewart Campbell waited. When the jury returned, the atmosphere was heavy, almost fragile. The verdict was delivered by majority decision. Guilty. Guilty of abduction. Guilty of murder. Stewart Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would serve a minimum of 20 years before becoming eligible to apply for parole. There was no dramatic reaction from him. No confession. No apology. Just silence. For the Jones family, the verdict brought a strange mix of relief and devastation. Justice, legally speaking, had been served, but Danielle was still missing. There was no grave to visit. No place to lay flowers. No final goodbye. Police continued to question Campbell after his conviction, hoping he might finally reveal where he had hidden her body. He refused, and that refusal would shape the next chapter of this story, not just for Danielle's family, but for other families across the United Kingdom facing the same cruel reality. Because sometimes a conviction is not the end. Sometimes it's only the beginning of a different kind of sentence for everyone left behind. When the verdict was delivered at Chelmsford Crown Court, it marked the legal conclusion of the trial. Stewart Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. The jury had accepted the prosecution's argument that Danielle Jones was dead and that her uncle was responsible. It was one of the rare murder convictions secured in the United Kingdom without the recovery of a body. But for Danielle's family, the verdict did not feel like an ending. A life sentence carries structure. It has a beginning, a minimum term system of review. Grief without a body does not follow that structure. It lingers in uncertainty. There is no grave to visit, no confirmed resting place, no physical marker that signals finality. The absence becomes permanent, and with it comes a different kind of emotional burden. After his conviction, Stewart Campbell maintained his innocence. He did not admit to killing Danielle. He did not disclose the location of her remains. Police continued to question him in the years that followed, hoping time or circumstance might lead him to cooperate. It never did. His silence became one of the defining features of the case. For investigators, the lack of a body left unanswered questions about the precise circumstances of Danielle's death. While the court had determined that she had been murdered, the exact location and method were never conclusively established in public detail. The prosecution had proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt through telecommunications data, forensic evidence, behavioral patterns, and the falsified text message sent from Danielle's phone. Yet the physical evidence that typically closes a homicide case remained missing. Danielle's parents faced a reality that many families of missing victims understand too well. Without remains, there is no opportunity for traditional mourning rituals. Funerals serve not only as memorials, but as psychological markers of transition. In this case, that transition never fully arrived. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays continued to pass without resolution. In the years after the trial, searches were carried out in various locations based on tips and intelligence. Wooded areas were examined. Sections of river were searched. Land was excavated when new information surfaced. Each operation required emotional preparation from the family. Each time investigators broke ground, hope returned in fragile form. And each time nothing was found, the sense of incompleteness deepened. As time passed, the broader legal system began to confront a difficult issue raised by cases like this one. What happens when a convicted murderer refuses to reveal the location of a victim's body? Before 2020, failure to disclose such information was considered by the parole board, but there was no specific statutory requirement compelling that consideration to be central. That changed with the introduction of legislation, commonly known as Helen's Law, named after murder victim Helen McCourt. The law requires the parole board to explicitly consider an offender's failure to disclose the whereabouts of a victim's remains when assessing suitability for release. Danielle's case was frequently referenced during public discussions surrounding the reform. It highlighted the emotional impact on families when offenders withhold information that could provide closure. When Stuart Campbell became eligible to apply for parole after serving his minimum term, the review process began. Parole decisions in the UK focus on risk to the public rather than punishment alone. A prisoner must demonstrate insight into their offending behavior, show evidence of rehabilitation, and satisfy the board that they no longer pose a significant danger. In Campbell's case, continued denial of responsibility weighed heavily. Without admission or cooperation, demonstrating insight becomes difficult. The parole board ultimately denied release, concluding that he remained a risk. As a result, he continues to serve his sentence. For Danielle's family, each parole review reopens old wounds. Victim impact statements must be prepared again. The events of 2001 are revisited in legal detail. The process can feel like a repetition of the trial itself. Even when release is denied, the emotional toll of revisiting the case remains substantial. Over 2 decades have passed since Danielle disappeared on her way to school. She would now be an adult in her late 30s. Yet in public memory, she remains 15, captured in school photographs and missing person posters. Time moves forward, but the image associated with her case does not age. The case continues to be studied in legal and criminological contexts. It demonstrated that murder can be proven without a body when circumstantial evidence forms a coherent and compelling narrative. Telecommunications analysis, forensic linguistics, and DNA evidence played central roles. The trial showed how modern investigative methods could compensate for the absence of traditional physical proof. At the same time, it exposed the psychological tactics of grooming within a family context. The gradual erosion of boundaries, the manipulation of trust, and the creation of emotional dependence were central themes during the prosecution. These elements have since informed safeguarding discussions and public awareness campaigns about coercive control and exploitation. Despite the legal outcome, one central fact remains unchanged. Danielle has never been found. Somewhere, there is a location known only to the person convicted of her murder. Whether that information will ever be disclosed is uncertain. Some offenders eventually provide details. Others maintain silence indefinitely. The sentence imposed by the court may last for the rest of Stuart Campbell's life. The sentence experienced by Danielle's family has no defined endpoint. It is shaped by absence rather than confinement. Justice, in legal terms, was achieved when the jury delivered its verdict. Justice, in personal terms, remains incomplete, and so the case stands as both a conclusion and an ongoing reality. A conviction secured without a body, a family left without a grave, and a silence that continues to echo long after the courtroom emptied.